You are standing in the lobby of Holloway Tower with a cardboard box in your arms, your name badge already deactivated, watching the CEO's assistant avoid your eyes as 30 employees pretend not to watch you being escorted out. Company policy, Cordelia Ashfield had said, barely looking up from her tablet. We're restructuring the janitorial contract. Effective immediately. You are 44 years old. You have a 6-year-old daughter at home who hasn't spoken a single word in 8 months. And you just lost the only job that let you pick her up from school every single day at exactly 3:15. You don't say anything. You just pick up the box and you walk toward the door. You are Josiah Winterburn, and 3 years ago, your world went completely silent in more ways than one. If stories about quiet strength, fatherhood, and the moments that remind us what really matters mean something to you, this channel is exactly where you want to be. Go ahead and hit subscribe now, because Josiah's story is only just beginning, and it will stay with you long after it ends. Your wife, Marisol, died 3 years ago in a car accident on a rain-soaked highway outside of Dayton, on her way home from a night shift at the hospital where she worked as a labor and delivery nurse. You were the one who got the phone call. You were the one who had to explain somehow to a 3-year-old girl named Calla why her mother wasn't coming home. Calla stopped speaking 4 months after the funeral. Not gradually, all at once, the way a light switches off. The doctors called it selective mutism brought on by traumatic grief, a temporary shutting down of the part of her that felt safe enough to use her voice in a world that had just proven, violently and without warning, that safety was not guaranteed. They said it might last months. It had now lasted 3 years. You had been a mid-level operations manager at a shipping logistics company before. Marisol died, a job with decent pay and, more importantly, predictable hours. But grief has a way of reshuffling every priority you thought was fixed. And within 6 months of the funeral, you realized the job's overtime. Demands and irregular travel were incompatible with being the only parent a silent, grieving little girl had left in the world. So you took the janitorial position at Holloway Tower, a corporate headquarters downtown, 40 stories, of glass and ambition, and specifically because the overnight shift ended at 6 a.m., giving you exactly enough time to get Calla ready for school, walk her there yourself, and be waiting at the gate every afternoon at 3:15 when the other kids ran to parents who didn't have to double-check the clock the way you always did. You took a 50% pay cut to make that schedule work. You sold Marisol's car because you no longer needed 2 vehicles and every dollar mattered now. You moved into a smaller apartment, the kind with paper-thin walls and a radiator that groaned all winter, because the mortgage on the house you'd shared with Marisol had become impossible to manage alone. You did all of it without complaint, because the alternative, missing pickup, leaving Calla with someone else, breaking the one fragile routine that seemed to keep her tethered to the world, was simply not a version of fatherhood you were willing to accept. You had worked at Holloway Tower for 2 years and 8 months when everything changed, and in that time you had become, without ever intending to, something of a quiet fixture in the building's early morning rhythm. You knew which floors had the temperamental elevators. You knew which executives arrived earliest and preferred the lobby lights already on. You had, over time, developed a particular kindness toward the overnight security guard, an elderly man named Thackeray Voss, who often shared his thermos of coffee with you during the slow hours between 2 and 4 a.m., the two of you talking quietly about grief. His wife had passed 5 years earlier, in the specific, unhurried way that only people who've genuinely lost something can talk to each other. You never talked about Calla to your co-workers, not out of shame, but because it hurt too much to explain her silence to people who would inevitably ask well-meaning, impossible questions. You kept your 2 worlds, the fluorescent-lit quiet of the tower at night, and the small, careful world you'd built with your daughter, entirely separate. That separation cracked unexpectedly. On a Tuesday morning in October, the day the new CEO's daughter first visited the building. Cordelia Ashfield had taken over as CEO of Holloway Innovations 8 months earlier, following her father's retirement, and she carried the particular brittle intensity of someone determined to prove to a board of directors still whispering about nepotism that she had earned the position on merit rather than bloodline. She was, by most accounts, competent, sharp with numbers, aggressive with growth targets, unafraid to make cuts that older executives found politically risky. But she ran the company with a cold, transactional efficiency that left little room for the human texture of the people working beneath her. To Cordelia, you were not Josiah Winterburn, a grieving father raising a traumatized daughter alone. You were a line item in a janitorial services contract that her cost-cutting consultants had flagged as an unnecessary in-house expense. You didn't know any of that yet. Standing in the lobby that October morning, mopping near the reception desk before the building opened, when the elevator chimed and a small girl walked out ahead of her mother, clutching a stuffed rabbit, looking lost in the enormous marble lobby, Cordelia's daughter, you would later learn was named Fable, and she was 6 years old, and something about the quiet, careful way she moved through that lobby, scanning for an exit that felt safe, the particular hyper-awareness of a child who has learned that the world doesn't always explain itself kindly, struck you immediately, though you couldn't yet have said why. You didn't approach her. You simply continued mopping near the reception desk, humming very softly the way you sometimes did during the overnight shifts, to keep the silence from feeling too heavy. Fable stopped walking. She turned toward the sound, and for reasons you wouldn't understand until much later, she walked directly toward you, sat down on the marble floor a few feet away, and simply watched you work, calm in a way her mother, tapping anxiously at her phone by the elevator, clearly was not. You learned over the following weeks that Fable Ashfield had also stopped speaking after a traumatic loss. Her father, Cordelia's ex-husband, had died by suicide 18 months earlier, a fact the company's polished public image had carefully kept out of any profile. Written about its rising young CEO, Fable's silence, like Calla's, was not defiance. It was the particular, devastating quiet of a child whose safety had been shattered by something no one had prepared her for. Cordelia, overwhelmed by grief she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge, publicly and terrified of appearing anything less than in control to a board, already skeptical of her, had thrown herself entirely into the company, leaving Fable largely in the care of nannies who rotated through so frequently that the girl had stopped bothering to learn their names. You didn't know the full weight of that story yet. You only knew that some mornings, when Cordelia had an early meeting and brought Fable along rather than leaving her with yet another temporary sitter, the girl would find you in whatever corner of the building you were cleaning and simply sit nearby watching, saying nothing, needing nothing except the quiet, undemanding presence of someone who didn't require her to perform being okay. You started humming the same song each time, an old lullaby Marisol used to sing to Calla, something soft and wordless enough that it asked nothing of anyone listening. You noticed one morning in November that Fable's lips moved very slightly along with the melody. Though no sound came out, you said nothing about it. You simply kept humming, the way you always did, and let her sit exactly as close or as far as she needed to. The morning everything changed. You had brought Calla to work with you, a rare exception, made only because her school had an unexpected teacher in service day and your usual arrangement with an elderly neighbor had fallen through at the last minute. You had cleared it apologetically with your shift supervisor, promising she would sit quietly in the break room with a coloring book while you worked, your final hour before her afternoon start time. You didn't know that Cordelia had brought Fable in that same morning for the same reason, an unexpected gap in childcare, an emergency board call that couldn't be rescheduled. You didn't know either that this was the exact morning Cordelia had scheduled a walkthrough of cost optimization measures with the building's facilities director, a walkthrough that would end within the hour with your termination. You were gathering your cart near the executive floor's break room when Cordelia found you, flanked by the facilities director and a clipboard-carrying consultant, her expression already arranged into the particular brisk efficiency she used for unpleasant announcements. "Josiah, is it?" she said, though you suspected. She already knew your name perfectly. Well, and simply preferred the distance, formality provided. "We're restructuring the janitorial contract, effective immediately. Company policy. I'm sure you understand." You felt your stomach drop, the particular cold plummet of a man doing rapid mental math about rent and groceries and school, shoes that already had holes worn through the toes. "Is there a reason?" you asked, your voice steadier than you expected. "I've been here almost 3 years. My reviews have always been—" "It's not performance-related," she said, already looking past you toward her phone. "It's a budget decision. Building maintenance is being outsourced to a national contractor. I'm sure you understand the practicalities. You did understand in the specific, exhausted way you had come to understand so many practicalities since Marisol died, that the world rarely pauses to consider whether you can absorb another loss before delivering it anyway. I have a daughter, you said, and you hated immediately how much it sounded like pleading, though you hadn't meant it that way. HR can walk you through severance options, Cordelia said, already turning to walk away. I really do have to get to a call. Standing there, watching her walk away, you felt something in your chest go very still. Not loud anger, but a quieter, more exhausted kind of grief. The particular grief of a man who has already given up so much and is being asked, apparently, to give up more. You thought, standing in that hallway, about every night you'd worked overnight shifts on 3 hours of sleep so you could still be present for callous mornings. You thought about the 50% pay cut, the sold car, the paper-thin apartment walls. You thought, for one honest, exhausted moment, about whether you had simply made a series of foolish sacrifices for a life that was never going to reward them. Maybe you thought, standing there with your mop bucket, you weren't cut out for this, for being enough alone, for a daughter who needed so much more than you sometimes felt equipped to give her. Maybe some other man, some more capable version of a father, would have found a way to keep the good job and still make the school pickups work. Maybe you had simply been failing quietly all along, and this termination was just the first visible proof of it. You stood with that doubt for a long moment. The particular loneliness of aging, alone into a harder version of your life than you'd ever planned for, wondering if you had the strength left to start over again. And then you walked to the break room to collect Calla, and you found her sitting exactly where you'd left her, except she wasn't alone. Fable Ashfield was sitting beside your daughter at the small break room table, the 2 girls' heads bent together over a shared coloring book. And though neither of them was speaking, something in the careful, easy quiet between them looked less like 2 silent children and more like 2 children who had simply found in each other someone who didn't require the exhausting performance of okay. You stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching, feeling something crack quietly open in your chest, not the collapsing feeling from the hallway, but something else, warmer and more complicated. That's when Cordelia arrived, phone still in hand, moving briskly toward the break room to collect her own daughter before her call, and stopped short in the doorway beside you, staring at the same scene. Fable looked up, and then, for the first time in 18 months, in front of her mother, in front of you, in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, she stood up, crossed the small room, and wrapped her arms tightly around your waist. Daddy hums that song too, she said. Her first words in over a year. Small, cracked from disuse, but unmistakably real. The break room went completely silent, save for the low hum of the vending machine in the corner. Cordelia's face had gone pale, her phone slipping slightly in her grip, her carefully composed CEO efficiency entirely gone, replaced by something rawer than you had ever seen from her. Fable? She whispered, kneeling slowly, as if any sudden movement might break whatever fragile thing had just happened. Sweetheart? Fable didn't let go of you, but she turned her head toward her mother. He hums Daddy's song, she said again, quieter this time, pointing at you without releasing her grip. The one from the video. The birthday video. You didn't fully understand yet what she meant. You would learn later from a shaking, tearful Cordelia sitting across from you in that same break room 20 minutes afterward, that her late husband had recorded a birthday video for Fable before he died. A simple video of him humming an old wordless lullaby, one he used to sing to her at bedtime, the last recorded piece of his voice that Fable had left. She had watched that video, Cordelia explained, hundreds of times in the months after his death, until eventually, devastatingly, she'd stopped being able to watch it at all, because hearing it hurt too much. The melody you had been humming for months, Marisol's old lullaby, wordless and soft, was, by some quiet and inexplicable coincidence, close enough in shape and rhythm to the melody. Fable's father used to hum that some deep, unspoken part of her had recognized it, had felt safe enough around it, had finally, after 18 silent months, found her voice again standing beside you. Cordelia sat across from you at that small break room table, tears streaming freely down a face that had spent 8 months rigidly composed for a boardroom that never once asked whether she was actually okay. I just fired you, she said, her voice breaking. An hour ago. I fired the only person who's made my daughter speak in over a year. You didn't know, you said quietly, and you meant it. There was no triumph in this moment for you, only the strange, overwhelming vertigo of watching two entirely separate griefs, yours and hers, turn out to have been quietly, circling each other for months without either of you realizing it. I need to fix this, Cordelia said. Not just the job. I don't even know where to start. You could start, you said gently, by sitting down here for a minute. Not as the CEO, just as Fable's mother. She did, and for several long minutes. The four of you sat in that small break room. You, Calla, Cordelia, and Fable, still gripping, your waist as though letting go might mean losing. Her voice all over again, while the ordinary corporate world outside continued on, entirely unaware of what had just quietly, permanently shifted inside it. The weeks that followed were not simple, because real healing rarely moves in a straight line, no matter how badly you want it to. Cordelia reversed your termination that same afternoon, though she was careful in the days that followed to make clear this wasn't merely a favor exchanged for her daughter's breakthrough. She reviewed your file properly for the first time, discovered an employee genuinely well regarded by every supervisor who'd ever managed you, and created within a month an entirely new position, head of facilities and family support services, a role explicitly designed to help other employees navigate exactly the kind of impossible scheduling crises single parents like you faced every single day. She also, quietly and without publicity, arranged regular visits between Fable and Calla, not initially for any strategic reason, but simply because both girls, in the aftermath of that break room afternoon, asked for each other by name, and neither Cordelia nor you had the heart to say no to the first genuinely happy request either child had made in longer than either of you could comfortably remember. Calla began speaking again, gradually over the following months. First single words, mostly to Fable, then short sentences, then by spring, something approaching her old chattering self, though gentler now, more careful with her words, the way children often become after learning. Too young how quickly things can be lost. You think some evenings now? Sitting on the small balcony of the slightly larger apartment you eventually moved into, listening to Calla's voice drifting through the screen door as she tells Fable, over video call, some elaborate story about her day, about how close you came to believing, standing in that hallway with a mop bucket and a deactivated badge, that you simply weren't capable of being enough. You think about every single parent watching this story who has stood exactly where you stood, exhausted, underestimated, quietly convinced that their sacrifices were invisible, that their worth had been reduced to a line item on someone else's budget. You want to tell them what it took you 3 years of silence, sacrifice, and one impossible morning to finally understand. Showing up quietly, faithfully, for a child who needs you is never a small thing, even when the world around you fails to notice it. You were never just a janitor mopping floors before dawn. You were the reason two little girls, in the quiet middle of their grief, finally found their way back to their own voices. They saw a man mopping floors. She saw the father who gave her daughter her voice back.